ładny. Exploring the upper corridor, or Haute-Ville, and this area of the city is actually much larger and also much newer than the lower corridor. The majority of buildings here date from the 19th century, though we do have a few from the 17th and 18th century. One thing you'll notice is that this part is also a bit more authentic, because the lower city I kind of felt was a bit of a tourist trap. And this is where I was originally going to stay, but I'm glad I didn't, because there's construction right out front. Original Quebec City Town Hall. I finally have some wildlife in this city. After exploring several options, we decided to settle on the restaurant Saint-Louis for dinner tonight. Above me here is the Parc des Cavaliers des Moulins. It was here where in 1608 Samuel de Champlain chose to build his fort Saint-Louis. The site is named for the windmill that once stood here. The cannons would have been directly on the ground, and the mill completed the defensive walls. With the construction of the new rampart, Fort Saint-Louis was gradually abandoned, and its mill was knocked down at the end of the French regime. The British constructed some buildings here which burned down in 1844. The restored wall dates from exactly the same period. Today this Cavalier is all that remains of the city's first fortifications. You can see here that all of the historic homes of the old rich colonists have been converted into businesses. Well, here we have a shop selling some art pieces from former French and British colonies of Africa and Oceania. There we have some Inuit art. Although Quebec is most synonymous with the French, throughout the 1800s, a large number of Irish immigrants also arrived here and also influenced a lot of the local culture. And that influence is most evident in traditional Quebecois music.
Unfortunately, we don't. We just don't do like the French shows or the crave shows.
Okay.
We can. For two? No reservation?
No. We managed to find one of the few restaurants in the area that serves breakfast, and it just so happens to be one of the city's most popular Quebecois restaurants. They also serve beer and ribs for breakfast. Back during the colonial era, it was actually a division between the classes where the working class people and the artists and vendors would all live in the lower city, and up here in the upper city is where the government officials, soldiers, and religious officials. But as the city's population grew and overcrowding set in, many of the city's upper-class residents were forced to sell their large tracts of vacant land to make room for commoners. And one such home was built in 1690 by master roofer François Jacquet de Langevin. In fact, today is the oldest surviving home in Quebec City and one of the oldest in the entire province. The first wooden home was built here in 1675 on land acquired from the Ursaline. Nowadays, however, it's actually been converted into one of the city's finest restaurants, serving traditional Quebecois cuisine. Despite having undergone several modifications, still remains one of the last examples of traditional New French architecture. In 1639, 3 Ursaline nuns under the leadership of Mother Mary the Incarnation arrived in Quebec City from France and founded this monastery, thus spearheading the French missionary movement in North America. 2 years later, the first monastery was completed and the colony's first young girls' school opened. At first, only a few indigenous girls attended, whose success and conversion rate was higher than that of indigenous boys who studied under the Jesuits, possibly due to mutual respect, which involved the nuns learning the native language. But 30 years later, it would become reserved exclusively for young girls of French background. Though the first 2 monasteries would be ravaged by fire, the nuns persisted. The first Ursulines were quick to develop a reputation for art and embroidery. When the city was surrendered to the British in 1759, the nuns agreed to provide British troops with accommodations, command centers, and medical care. In exchange, they served them and were allowed to resume their teachings. For a brief period, this included English Protestants. By the 19th century, a normal school had been established, and it had become one of the most acclaimed learning institutions, instructing in subjects well beyond theology to mostly middle-class students. And today the complex contains the largest surviving pre-18th century structures in Canada, containing fine examples of traditional French colonial architecture. Being from California, they're here. It's familiar as a gold weighing scale, but here they didn't use it to weigh gold, but prescription medicine. Over here we have some busts of famous composers. The French have always had a passion for enriching themselves and others through science and art, research, exploration, and discovery, and this museum showcases that beautifully. It's incredible what the French achieved here. Although the Ursulines have been doing their best to preserve and pass on their legacy, interest in the monastic lifestyle has heavily dwindled in the ever-changing social climate of modern Quebec, and in recent years the school has broken away from one of its core traditions by now admitting boys.
Merci, vous autres aussi, vous êtes super bons.
It's like the chapel of the Ursaline Monastery, and although it was only constructed, the current chapel, in 1902, it houses some of the Ursuline's finest treasures. Among them are what art historians claim to be the finest and best preserved wood carvings from Canada's French period. It was the church that actually had the most control over the colony. I am inside the Holy Trinity Cathedral. Constructed at the turn of the 19th century, it was the first Anglican cathedral to be built outside the British Isles. This one thankfully hasn't been converted into a library. beautiful building you see behind me is the Central Post Office. The building was constructed in 1873, and in 1913 the false facade with columns and cupola were added. And the post office building is named in honor of Louis S. Saint Laurent, former Canadian Prime Minister who resided in Quebec. In front of the post office stands a monument dedicated to Saint Francois de Laval, the first bishop of Quebec. Right here we have a statue of Louis Hebert, who was a 16th century Parisian widely considered to be the first pharmacist and farmer in what's now Canada. He also imported the first ox to the region, and his son married the first wife born in New France. This is interesting. I've stumbled onto the town's famous Rue du Tresor, which is basically the small pedestrian only street that serves as an open air art gallery. Founded in 1647, it was also the first parochial church north of Mexico. The current church we see, however, was pieced together throughout the 18th and 20th centuries, with the original design expanded each time, the result of the many fires it has sustained throughout its life. For this reason, it has been dubbed the most extensively expanded and transformed structure in Canada's history, still dedicated to its original purpose. Although the facade remained unfinished, it was still regarded as the most elaborate neoclassical church frontispiece in all of Quebec. The first bishop of Quebec, Saint Francois de Laval, and General Governor Frontenac are both buried here. And in 1874, its elevation to minor basilica by Pope Pius IX made it the very first official Catholic pilgrimage site in North America. And right next to the oldest church in Canada is the oldest university. Oh, this is a nice little view attraction. We're in the courtyard of the Laval Institute. Founded in 1663 by the first bishop of Quebec, it is also the oldest French-speaking university in North America, and is one of the finest examples of New France architecture in Quebec. Though its origins began strictly as a seminary school, it was transformed to incorporate the liberal arts following the British conquest. Then its fields of study were diversified even more in the 20th century, to include fields such as law, medicine, forestry, and household science. And this one right here is actually the School of Architecture. Oh, this really feels like I'm in Europe. In 1639, 3 French nuns of the Augustine order stepped ashore in Quebec City and founded the first hospital in North America, north of Mexico. Despite the lack of medical advances, their hospital actually had a high cure rate for both French and indigenous patients. This was thanks largely in part to their dedication and high degree of expertise they had acquired in France, as well as assistance from the colony's first physicians. In fact, it was here that in 1700, French physician Michel Sarrazin performed the first mastectomy in North America on a nun who went on to live breast cancer-free for another 40 years. The nuns also learned how to manufacture their own medicine from herbal plants. The monastery sort of became the region's first pharmacy, with patients traveling from as far as Halifax to receive treatment and consultation. The Augustines managed the hospital for nearly 3 centuries, and it was only handed over to the government in 1962. With the old generation of nuns gradually disappearing and the new generation of Quebecers expressing disinterest in the monastic lifestyle, in true French fashion, the order came up with an ingenious and novice solution to preserve their history and legacy. The first was the creation of a museum, the second the creation of a care center, and the third the creation of a tourist hotel, where visitors can opt to stay in a modern room or have an authentic monastic experience. In fact, a Nat Geo Traveler named it the #1 travel experience for a physical and mental reboot. One thing that's unusual about Quebec City is that normally when you see monasteries, they would typically build them in secluded places so they could concentrate on their prayers, but here in Quebec City, the city actually offered protection against hostile enemies, so that's why a lot of the monasteries were built inside the city walls. This cool but also somewhat unusual looking building is the Dauphine Redoubt, one of the oldest military buildings in North America. Construction began in 1712 and it was finally completed nearly 3 decades later. Redoubts were either permanent or temporary structures that were constructed outside the main fort to help shield against heavy artillery and protect soldiers outside the main defensive line. In this case, however, it ended up being turned into a barracks, which would eventually house French, English, and Canadian soldiers. And there's some furniture inside. You can see it's a really cool attraction and not very many tourists seem to know about. As I was taking a look around back to our hotel, we stumbled upon Artillery Park. I actually wasn't planning to visit this, but this is really cool. What's cool is that you can actually walk on some of these.
Okay.
From up here, they would have had a spectacular view and would have been able to defend the entire city. And today it offers spectacular views for tourists. It's the only city in North America that looks like this. This one right here is called the St. John's Gate. This all used to be cobblestone streets. Now we have asphalt and cars driving through here. All of this actually isn't original. A lot of it was actually restored in the 1800s. That's so great that Institute decided to preserve this.